Marcus Webb almost didn't see it. He was 16 years old, sitting at a reading table in the Harrow County Historical Archive on a Thursday afternoon in February 2026, working on a school project about local geography, when he unrolled the map. It was one of 17 in the donated Callaway collection, hand-drawn, pencil on drafting paper, slightly yellowed at the edges, dated in the upper right corner, spring 1985. He set it flat, weighted the corners with his notebook and his water bottle, and leaned in to study it. And then he stopped. He knew cartographic symbols. He had spent the last 8 months building an orienteering app for his school's STEM competition, which required him to study standard topographic notation until it was second nature: contour lines, benchmarks, water features, trail markers. He knew what each symbol was supposed to mean. And the symbols on this map were wrong. Not random, structured, consistent, deliberate, but not standard. Someone had built a second language into this drawing, designed to look like an ordinary survey map to anyone who didn't know enough cartography to notice the deviation. Marcus noticed. He photographed every inch of all 17 maps that afternoon, thanked the archive librarian, and took his photographs home. He spent the next 3 weeks at his desk. What he found inside those maps would close a case that had been cold for 41 years, and would finally give a name to the person responsible for the death of Ruth Ellen Callaway, a 38-year-old geography teacher who had hidden the truth in the only language she trusted, and who had been killed before she could speak it out loud. To understand why Ruth built her evidence into a code, and what she was so desperate to document before someone stopped her, you have to go back to Denton, Tennessee. The summer it all fell apart, because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Ruth Callaway was. Denton, Tennessee sits in the folded country south of the Cumberland Plateau, where the hills come down in long blue ridges and the hollows hold their morning mist long past sunrise. In the summer of 1985, it was a town of roughly 2,800 people. The kind of place where the hardware store opened before 7, where the Memorial Day parade drew the whole county whether the weather cooperated or not, and where a teacher who had worked the same school for 12 years was as fixed a part of the local landscape as the water tower on Ridge Hill. Ruth Ellen Callaway had taught geography at Denton High School since 1973. In 12 years, she had become one of those teachers that students remember not for the subject, but for the quality of attention she brought to it. The way she would unroll a topographic map across 3 pushed-together desks and say, quietly, that a landscape tells you everything about the people who lived on it, if you know how to read it. Her classroom smelled like pencil shavings and the particular mustiness of old paper. And on the wall behind her desk, she kept a hand-drawn map of Harrow County that she updated every spring, walking the ridges with a compass and a notebook. She was 38 years old. She had been widowed 2 years earlier when her husband James died of a heart attack at 41. A sudden, bewildering loss that left her to raise their son Thomas alone on a teacher's salary in a house that still felt too quiet in the evenings. Thomas was 11 in 1985, a serious and watchful boy who had learned, from years of sitting beside his mother at the kitchen table on summer nights, to respect the concentration of someone doing something they loved without needing to explain why they loved it. What Ruth loved, beyond the classroom, was mapping. She had drawn charts of the county's ridges and creek beds her entire adult life, careful records of old property lines, forgotten wagon routes, the slow shift of the forest edge against cleared land. It was the kind of obsessive, private cartography that had no audience beyond herself, and the occasional bemused colleague who found it charming. In the spring of 1985, she had been accepted to a summer cartography program at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, the first formal recognition her work had ever received. She had told her sister on the phone that she planned to go, that she was finally going to do something just for herself. She had also, in the months before her death, begun to document something her maps were never meant to hold. The eastern section of Harrow County had seen a quiet expansion of mining operations over the previous 2 years. New extraction sites opened by Haney Mining and Excavation, a company owned by a man named Earl Haney, 62 years old, whose family had been in Denton since before the county had paved roads. Haney employed 63 people at the peak of his operations, donated regularly to the volunteer fire department, and sat on the county commission, and was, in the comfortable phrase of small-town life, well regarded. On her rambles through the eastern ridges that spring, Ruth had noticed several sites where the ground had been disturbed in ways that had nothing to do with standard extraction. Discolored earth, dead vegetation in patterns that didn't match drought or disease. A chemical smell rising from certain hollows on warm mornings that did not belong in mountain air. She had started mapping those sites. She had told no one. She was waiting until she had enough documentation to be taken seriously, until she could walk into the state environmental office with something undeniable in her hands. She planned to go after school let out for summer. School let out on a Friday. That Friday was June 7, 1985. Ruth stayed at her desk until 4 in the afternoon, packing her classroom for the year, rolling her maps into their tubes. Thomas was at a friend's house for the weekend. The honeysuckle was heavy on the fence at the edge of the schoolyard. She waved to a colleague in the parking lot. She drove home. That was the last time anyone who knew her saw her alive. Ruth Ellen Calloway was found on the morning of June 8th by her neighbor Margaret Sills, who had come over to return a borrowed casserole dish and found the front door standing open. Ruth was inside. She had been there for hours. The medical examiner set the time of death between 9 and 11 the previous evening. There had been a struggle near the back of the house, a broken chair, overturned storage boxes, the particular disorder of a space that had been loud and then went suddenly very quiet. Margaret Sills called the Harrow County Sheriff's Department at 7:14 a.m. Deputies arrived at 7:29. Thomas was brought home by his friend's parents just before noon and was told, in the careful language adults use with children in moments like this, what had happened. He was 11 years old. He stood in the doorway of his house and did not go inside for a long time. The first officer on scene noted in his report that the house was orderly throughout except for the storage area, and that there were maps everywhere, rolled in tubes along the hallway, pinned to a corkboard in the front room, laid flat on the kitchen table beneath a magnifying glass. The maps were catalogued as potential evidence and collected. On the kitchen table, open beside the maps, was a green canvas-field notebook. Its pages were filled with symbols, the same notations that appeared across Ruth's hand-drawn charts. Investigator Deputy Leon Marsh photographed the notebook and logged it into evidence. Neither he nor anyone else in the department could interpret what the symbols meant. At some point between 4 in the afternoon and 9 in the evening on June 7, 1985, someone had come to Ruth Calloway's door. Someone she had very likely let inside. The door showed no signs of forced entry. In Ruth's coat pocket, hanging on the hook beside the door, investigators found a sealed envelope. It was addressed to the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation in Nashville. It had not been mailed. The contents were never recovered. Whether she had placed them somewhere for safekeeping or whether they were removed by the person who killed her, no one has been able to determine. The envelope was logged and filed. The notebook was logged and filed. The maps were taken into evidence storage. And for the next 41 years, they sat in boxes in 3 different facilities, holding every secret Ruth had tried to put to paper, waiting for someone who could read them. Detective Carl Hobbs of the Harrow County Sheriff's Department had been working violent crimes for 16 years when the Calloway case came to him in the summer of 1985. He was a methodical man, slow to draw conclusions, careful in a way that he knew was sometimes mistaken for stubbornness. He worked the case through that summer with the concentrated attention of someone who understood that the first weeks were when a case either opened or closed, and who was increasingly disturbed by how thoroughly this one refused to open. His first serious suspect was a man named Denny Force, a drifter who had been seen in Denton for several weeks that spring, and who carried a prior conviction for breaking and entering from a neighboring county. Force was located in Cookville 3 weeks after the murder. He had no alibi for the night of June 7th, no credible explanation for his presence in Harrow County, and a history that made him a reasonable person of interest. He was held, questioned at length, and ultimately released. No physical evidence placed him inside Ruth's home. The reconstruction of his movements over the previous months, once completed, made his presence on that specific road, that specific night, effectively impossible to establish. Which left Hobbs looking at the maps. He had 17 of Ruth's drawings reviewed by a cartography instructor at a community college in Oak Ridge. The instructor confirmed they were competently executed local survey charts, unusually detailed for an amateur, representing roughly 40 square miles of eastern Harrow County's ridge and hollow country. She could not explain the symbols that didn't conform to standard notation. She suggested Ruth may have developed a personal shorthand over years of practice, not uncommon in self-taught cartographers who worked alone. Hobbs filed the assessment and moved on. In August 1985, he interviewed Earl Haney. Haney sat across the table from him in the conference room of the Harrow County Sheriff's Department and expressed, in measured and appropriate terms, his condolences for Ruth's death. He had known her, he said, in the way you know everyone in a town this size: community events, school board meetings, the county fair. A fine teacher, by all accounts. A tragedy. He had been at the county commission meeting on the evening of June 7th. The meeting had run until just past 10 o'clock. 6 other commissioners confirmed his presence. The sign-in sheet, preserved in the county clerk's records, bore his signature in at the top of the page. Hobbs had nowhere to go. The maps were held in evidence for 2 years. In 1987, in accordance with standard protocol, they were returned to the estate along with Ruth's other personal effects. Her sister Patricia collected 4 cardboard boxes. Thomas, grown and living in Chattanooga, eventually inherited them. When he moved back to Denton in 2009 to help care for Patricia in her final years, he donated 17 of the maps to the Harrow County Historical Archive as a memorial to his mother. He kept the green canvas notebook. He was not sure why. He put it in a box in his basement. "I used to look at the maps when I was a kid," he said in an interview after the case was resolved. "I always felt like she was trying to tell me something, and I just couldn't hear it." By 1995, 10 years had passed. The high school had a new gymnasium. The fire department had a new engine, funded in part by a donation from Haney Mining and Excavation. Ruth Calloway's name appeared in the school hallway on a memorial plaque, a small bronze rectangle that new students walked past without reading. By 2005, 20 years. Thomas was 31, working as an electrician in Chattanooga. He called Patricia every Sunday. He had opened the green notebook twice since boxing it up, and closed it both times. By 2015, 30 years. Carl Hobbs had been retired for 14 years. He still thought about the Calloway case in the intermittent, nagging way of something left unfinished. Not often, but with the regularity of a clock you don't hear until the room goes quiet. He had told his wife, more than once, that those maps meant something. That Ruth Calloway had put something into them that nobody had been able to read. He died in March 2019 at 77, with the case still in the open files of the Harrow County Sheriff's Cold Case Archive. Earl Haney had retired from active business in 1998 and handed the mining operation to a nephew. He remained in Denton for another 15 years, attending church and the occasional civic function, before moving to a nursing facility in Knoxville in 2013. He had a room on the second floor with a window that faced the parking lot. He was 84 years old in 2026 and had not been back to Harrow County in 11 years. The Calloway donation sat in the Harrow County Historical Archive in acid-free folders inside flat storage drawers, properly labeled, correctly cataloged, and entirely unread, until the Thursday in February 2026, when Marcus Webb spread the third map flat on the reading table and weighted its corners with his water bottle. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to Ruth. The case had been cold for 41 years, when a 16-year-old finally learned to read her language. Marcus was a junior at Denton High, enrolled in an accelerated STEM track, with a particular self-taught enthusiasm for the intersection of coding and spatial data. He had built his orienteering app over the previous summer for the state STEM competition, and the project had required him to master standard cartographic notation systems thoroughly enough to replicate them digitally. He knew what every symbol was supposed to mean, and more importantly, he knew what a symbol looked like when it meant something else. His history teacher, Miss Arden, had assigned a local geography project with an archival component. Students were encouraged to consult primary sources at the Harrow County Historical Archive. Marcus had gone in looking for old survey records of the Eastern Ridge country. A librarian had directed him to the Calloway donation. He had unrolled the first map with no particular expectation. By the third map, he knew something was wrong. By the fifth, he knew it was intentional. He photographed all 17 that afternoon and took his photographs home. He worked the problem the way he worked code, systematically, eliminating possibilities, testing substitutions. The cipher was a personal system, standard cartographic symbols reassigned to represent specific locations, dates, and brief encoded descriptions, built from a notational logic that derived from Ruth's own surveying shorthand. The key to the code, in other words, was Ruth's own habit of mind. It took Marcus nearly a week to identify the underlying pattern, and another 2 weeks to apply his decoding to all 17 maps. On a Sunday evening in early March, he laid his translated notes across the floor of his bedroom and read what Ruth Calloway had been trying to say. 7 sites in eastern Harrow County, dated from October 1984 through May 1985. Each identified by terrain features and encoded coordinates, each accompanied by brief descriptions, ground disturbance, chemical odor, discoloration of surrounding vegetation, proximity to Haney mining operations. The entries grew more detailed and more urgent as the dates progressed toward spring 1985. The final entry was dated June 5, 1985, 2 days before her death. The encoded note beside it read, in Marcus's translation, "E.H. knows I was here. He saw my car on the Ridge Road. 2 days before she was killed." Marcus brought his decoded maps and his translation notes to Miss Arden on a Monday morning. Miss Arden read them twice, set them down, and called the Harrow County Historical Archive. The archive director called the county sheriff's office. The sheriff's office called the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Cold Case Unit. It took 11 days to reach Detective Yolanda Pierce, who had been running the TBI Cold Case Division for 6 years, and who recognized, from the first summary she read, that what she was looking at was not a coding project. It was a confession waiting to be heard. 11 days after Pierce got the call, she was in Thomas Calloway's kitchen in Chattanooga, sitting across the table from a 52-year-old man who had kept his mother's notebook in a box for 30 years. She told him what a 16-year-old at Denton High had found inside his mother's maps. Thomas didn't speak for a moment. Then he got up, went to the basement, and came back with the green canvas notebook. He set it on the table between them. "I always knew she was trying to say something," he said. "I just couldn't hear her." TBI investigators worked quickly once they had the decoded map in hand. 2 of the 7 sites Ruth had documented were excavated under forensic and environmental warrant in April 2026. Both contained chemical deposits consistent with the industrial byproducts of mining extraction operations. The specific compound signatures matched substances documented in the operational records of Haney Mining and Excavation from the mid-1980s. Records show that the EPA had briefly opened a permit review of Haney Mining in 1987, 2 years after Ruth's death, and had closed it as non-actionable for insufficient documentation. Ruth's documentation had been sitting in a county archive for 17 years when that review closed. The green canvas notebook, turned over to investigators with Thomas's cooperation, contained additional field notes for 4 of the 7 sites, the same encoded notation system Marcus had decoded. On page 31, in the margin beside the entry for June 5th, Ruth had written in plain English, "Not in code, not in any cipher, 2 words, I'm afraid." They were the only unencoded words in the entire notebook. The original case evidence had been transferred to TBI cold case storage in a 1994 consolidation of Harrow County files. Among the items preserved was a cigarette butt collected from the floor near Ruth's back storage room in June 1985. In 1985, forensic technology did not exist. In the decades since, the Calloway case had not risen to the threshold for priority testing in a system managing hundreds of open files. Investigators now requested full DNA analysis. The result came back in May 2026. Earl Haney, age 84. Room 214, Creekside Memory Care and Rehabilitation, Knoxville, Tennessee. On a Tuesday morning in June 2026, 2 TBI agents drove to Knoxville. The arrest was quiet in the way arrests of very old men in nursing facilities are always quiet. No chase, no resistance, no raised voice. Haney was sitting in a chair beside his window when they arrived. He looked at the warrant. He said nothing. His attorney, reached by phone 40 minutes later, entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. The community's reaction in Denton, when the story broke in the county paper and then across state outlets, was the particular silence of people reassembling something that had always been in front of them. Earl Haney had funded their fire department. His company had employed their fathers. He had sat beside them at commission meetings for 20 years and looked exactly like what a respected citizen was supposed to look like. He had killed their geography teacher to keep her from going to Nashville with 40 square miles of evidence in her hands. Ruth's field notes, when the decoded maps and the notebook were read alongside the environmental samples from the excavated sites, told a story of a woman who had spent 8 months walking the ridges of her own county. In the evenings and on weekends, careful and methodical and growing more frightened as she accumulated more evidence. And realized, more clearly with every entry, that the man she was documenting was capable of understanding exactly what she was doing. She had encoded her findings because she no longer trusted that the findings themselves would survive if she left them in plain language. She had been right about that. She had just not been able to move fast enough. Thomas Calloway still kept a photograph of his mother on the wall of his kitchen. It was taken on the last day of school in 1984, the spring before her death, outside the front entrance of Denton High. One of those candid shots a colleague had taken when Ruth didn't know she was being photographed. She was standing in the June afternoon sunlight, with a rolled map tucked under one arm and her canvas bag slung over her shoulder, looking at something just outside the frame, and she was smiling in the way people smile when they are genuinely absorbed in what they're thinking about. Thomas said that the thing he remembered most about the morning he heard the case had been closed was not what he felt. That came later, in stages. But what he did. He went to the basement. He took out the green canvas notebook. He sat at his kitchen table and opened it all the way through for the first time, reading his mother's symbols, which he still could not decode, and thinking about the 16-year-old boy at Denton High who had. She was the best teacher in that school, he said. And not just because of geography. She taught you that the world has layers, that there's always more in a thing than you first see, if you're willing to look. The Calloway case, upon its resolution, prompted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to establish a forensic document analysis protocol for cold case files involving potentially coded or specialized archival materials, a process through which unresolved case documents can be submitted for cryptographic and specialist review. As of 2026, the protocol was being applied to 9 additional cold case files across the state. The TBI cited Marcus Webb's work as the direct catalyst for the program's creation. Marcus, when reached by local reporters, said he hadn't known anything about the Calloway case when he walked into the archive. He had just been doing homework. Ruth Ellen Calloway had believed that a landscape tells you everything about the people who lived on it, if you know how to read it. She built her evidence into the only language she fully trusted, the language of maps, of symbols, of notations that meant one thing on the surface and something entirely different beneath. She encoded the truth because she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent her life teaching people to look past the obvious, that truth sometimes has to survive by being hidden. She hid it carefully. She hid it well. And she waited, in the only way the dead can wait, for someone who knew how to find it. It took 41 years. It took a teenager doing homework on a Thursday afternoon. But it held. There are questions this case doesn't let you put down easily. A 16-year-old saw in a single afternoon what professional investigators, across 4 decades, never understood, and the only difference was a specific kind of knowledge that no one in 1985 thought to bring to the maps. How many other cold cases hinge on evidence that simply hasn't been given to the right person to read? Ruth Calloway spent 8 months building a record that was precise, careful, and devastating, and was killed before she could deliver it. What does it say about the gap between documenting the truth and being believed? And for Thomas Calloway, who carried his mother's notebook for 41 years without knowing it held her final testimony, what do you think it means to finally be able to hear someone speak? Justice found Ruth Ellen Calloway after 41 years, through the hands of a teenager who knew how to read a map. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.